So thank you so much for joining us today as we welcome Dr. Eric. How are
Thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
What are some things that really drew you to not only this line of work, but writing this book?
Yeah, it's not unusual for therapists that we end up specializing in some of the issues that we've dealt with ourselves. Um, I've been married for 24 years, but a few years into my marriage, I had a couple of affairs, one emotional, one sexual. And that's not who I am. That's not who I want to be. That's not how I want to treat the woman that I love. And through the course of my studies, where I could, I selected courses in sexuality. Where I could, I focused papers on sexual issues to try to understand more about why did I do this as a person who usually stands very firmly with my feet planted in ethical ground. How did I come to a place where I was doing things that are not a part of my values? And why was it so hard to stop? And that eventually led me to specializing in my private practice on sex and sexual issues, especially developing my capacity to connect with men's hearts and to understand men's sexuality. And so all of that eventually culminated in, my practice being situated where it is on sex and relationship issues. And somewhere in the Me Too movement, I got inspired to put what I've learned and developed to help men into a process of this book that came out.
Yes, and can you talk a little bit about just what kind of leads men to stray from relationships? Is it usually more emotional, physical? What, or at least in your experience, what have you seen from talking and experiencing it yourself?
Yeah, the quick summary, whether it's men or women or people of any gender straying, it's almost always quickly summarized as there's something going on for them that they don't know how to deal with another way. Something they don't know how to bring into the relationship, either in their hearts or their needs for emotional connection. It might be a sexual component, but I always want to be very careful about that because, our culture has a lot of myths about affairs that, if he strays, that means you didn't, satisfy him. That's not true. You know, what's happening is in him, he doesn't know how to bring in some aspect of his sexuality. Maybe he's got a divide that you don't do certain behaviors with the partner that you love or with the mother of your children. Um, and that divide in him, when he's unable to reconcile, how can I have passion and hot sex here with love and tenderness? That divide causes him to be unable to figure out how to reconcile that. So that's where I really try in my book to develop a pathway for men to integrate their hearts with everything going on below the waist so that they can understand it, so they can learn how to talk with their partners about it in a way with integrity and inside of their values.
And this is the second time you've mentioned values, and where for you or in your practice have you see where these values stem from? But specifically for you, like how did you shape and mold your own personal values and the values that you hold true or paramount?
Yeah, a little bit. There's certainly informed by sexuality, but by spirituality, and my experience growing up Catholic, my experience of being taught by men who were important in my life in my teen years about how to show up um, with consent and kindness and to not pressure. But I also find that it's important in my own experience to look at where my feet are. Sometimes we operate from the neck up. We create a list of values in our minds based on what we think those values should be, how we think we should be for other people. And sometimes it's important to notice, hey, beyond your neck up, what are your feet doing? What is it that you actually seem to value or get turned on by in practice? So, one of the things that I invite readers to do is to identify your top sexual values. What turns you on? Is it playfulness? Is it intensity? Is it passion? And by looking at those values, you get to attend to how are you living those values. And sometimes people don't want to be turned on by the things that they're turned on by. Sometimes they don't feel like that's right or they should. And it's important to find some path of integrity around that. In my clinical work, we call that an erotic conflict. And we have to find a way to acknowledge that, even if we're not going to put that into practice. Because if we aren't acknowledging what turns us on, if we're just trying to cut off parts of ourselves, then that's often the way that affairs or behavior that's against our values comes out, because there's a part of us that demands to be known, lived, and experienced. And we have to find a path to integrate that.
Yeah, and so how does some of that play out as you have noticed through media and other like pornography and television? I think we're so overly stimulated in so many different ways now. Like, how do you one balance that, but also when you talk about that experimentation, how do you um, deal with all these things that are kind of stimulating us to figure out what you would want?
Yeah, it's such a good question because there's so many different components to it. So let me try to just kind of hit a top three around pornography and the overstimulation from our culture. So, one, I think it's important to realize that um, pornography is not sex education. And a lot of men who don't receive better scientifically accurate sex education don't understand that pornography is a fantasy. Just the same way that I know I don't want to tie a fire hose around my waist and jump off a building and try to break into a window. As when we put it into the mode of like an action movie, we know that's a fantasy. We know we're not going to do that in real life. We know that that's not how physics work. We know that that's a performance. But when we take pornography, sometimes when we don't have better, more accurate sex education, we end up applying the myths, the fantasies of pornography to our partners and to our bedrooms, and we think that's how we show up, that's how we show up as the lover that is going to please a partner. And that's not accurate. That probably doesn't provide stimulation for your partner actually, and for concrete anatomy and biological reasons. So it's really important to understand the myths of pornography and the realities of real human sexuality, especially how that's different in long-term relationship. The second piece is, when we're viewing pornography, it's important to understand that just because we're viewing something and we might like viewing that, that may not be what turns us on in real life. There can be a divide between what we like to look at and see and what feels good to our bodies in real practice. And a lot of men get caught up in that fantasy, and then they start wanting to put that into real life, and they're not attending to the difference with their partner. They're not attending to the difference in their own psychology or sexual desire of, yeah, but does this actually feel good to everyone involved? And then the third piece that's so important is, whether you're viewing pornography or reading erotica or just fantasizing on your own, are you communicating with your partner about those behaviors? Are you communicating with your partner about those fantasies? And are you getting clear with them ahead of time about whether that's going to be put into practice mindfully, wisely, and collaboratively? Or are you just taking action on your own independently, thinking it's fine if I watch this, my partner will be okay with it? It's fine if I watch this and try to put it into practice. I think my partner will be okay with it. Really, this is where we're starting to talk about consent, right? Is my behavior in line with my relationship agreements? Is my behavior in line with the consent in the sexual experience that we're doing what we talked about doing?
To that consent point, actually, one of my next questions was the phrase "consent is sexy." I've heard that, a bunch of different times. But what does it mean to you? And then also, can you please elaborate on consent as a whole a little bit more?
Absolutely. So, to me, consent, I like to say consent can be sexy. And when we start, just like, riding your bicycle when you're first starting isn't cool. You're not going to be pulling any stunts. You're looking awkward. Your knees are going out to the side. Your handlebars are swinging back and forth. If you're practicing consent at first, that process is not skillful. It is awkward. It is hard to ask for what you want. Consent becomes sexy when you become proficient and skillful at it so that you can begin adding in questions and inquiries or offers about what you might want to do. Hey, how about if I do this? Hey, do you like that? Would you be interested in this? I could do that for you. It becomes sexy when we know how to frame things and how to respond to what our partner is asking from us in ways that keep that as a part of the foreplay. And in terms of consent, I have a number of different frameworks that I try to put forward. The first and most important one is just that, a consent script alone is not enough. We have to be in the process of managing our desire and managing our emotions. Because if you're just sitting there trying to ask the right questions so you can get the green lights, you can touch the things you want to touch, you're not present and mindful to what's being said. You're much more likely to hear a reluctant yes as a full yes. And you may not have as much emphasis on your own break, slowness, tenderness, like trying things out when you put it into practice that would be appropriate to a tentative yes. And so when we think about building our hearts and our capacities for consent, we have to start with our capacity to regulate our emotions. No consent script is going to replace our ability to check our own thoughts, check our own fantasies, and to be mindfully and presently engaged with our partner and with their emotions. And from there, I like to talk about consent as kind of having three parts: the beginning, the during, and the after. It's what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? And how are we going to make sure that we do have the pleasure we're looking for and that we don't have negative experiences in the process? During, it's about monitoring consent and making sure, hey, yes, my partner said yes, we could do this, but is my partner contracting? Are their muscles getting tense and rigid? Are they still emotionally and attentionally present here, or have they checked out? And especially with a new partner, you may not be able to know that. Some people go into what I'll call like an orgasm cave. They close their eyes, they fold into themselves psychologically so they can focus on their sensations. That might look very much like a person who's withdrawing from the moment because they don't like what's happening. So, especially with a new partner, you need to be paying attention and you need to be checking in. Hey, are you still here? Is everything still okay? Are we still doing all right? That allows you to monitor consent in process. And then there's an after part. Hey, how did that go for you? How did that feel? How are you feeling about what we did now? That process in the kink community is known as aftercare, but we don't need to be doing kinky things to follow up with our lovers and our partners just to ask, how did that go? How are you feeling? And making sure that what was intended in the consent process was fulfilled. Because that's what's lets our partner know that we value their experience more than just our intent. We're not just trying to get the gold star of being the good lover. We're trying to deliver care, we're trying to deliver pleasure, and we're interested in knowing if we succeeded.
Yep. Tina, did you have a question or just saying hello?
Yes, I do have a question.
Perfect. Yeah, go ahead and answer it or ask it, please.
Hey, Eric.
Hey, Tina.
Can you talk a little bit about how we discover our own whys, WHY, and how we can be better at that so that we can have that kind of open consent conversation with our partners?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, my interpretation of that is like, why does this turn me on? Why am I here? Why do I want to do this? And in that, I think if we look at our experiences, maybe even if we don't have that many experiences, if we look at our fantasies, we can attend to what are the emotions that I feel, whether I'm fantasizing about being dominant or submissive, if I'm fantasizing about a particular behavior, what's the feeling that that creates in me? And I think that feeling is one of the best orientations to why. Because now, if I'm saying yes to something, it's probably because I'm trying to get one of these positive emotional experiences that allow me to tap into my erotic self. I feel powerful. I feel sexy. I feel desired. And those are usually the emotional states that are driving our interest in sexual activity. And so when we know how we're trying to feel, then when our partner understands that, then we know, ultimately it's not about touching this, there, that way. Ultimately, it's I want to be touched there this way because that I've learned that creates a feeling in me that I like. And then, sometimes you tell the partner, touch this, there, that way, and it doesn't create that feeling. And when we adjust in that moment, we're reorienting to how will we create that feeling. And we don't need to stay focused on, judgments or critique or anything like you didn't do it right or not that way. Hey, that just didn't work. For whatever reason, that didn't create the feeling. Now, how else can we create that?
Yeah, can you talk to us a little bit about like spicing it up? Say you've been in a relationship for a while and what used to turn you on now is something else. Like, can you talk about how couples handle that as well and just your advice?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, in a long term relationship, whether it is just the familiarity that develops between us, we kind of know what we do, how we do it, and how long it lasts, that kind of for our attention, it doesn't keep that attention for many years at a time. And so, one of the elements of work in a long term relationship to keep things spicy, to keep things sexy and passionate, is to be in a process of self discovery and to be in a process of collaborative couples discovery. Hey, I was reading this book and they were talking about this thing, and we've never done that, but I found that it turned me on. Would you be interested in that? Could we try it? Maybe it's not even something I want to try, but I want to read it to you and share this part of my sexuality with you. And so often in couples early on, we start with what one author, David Schnarch, calls the sex of compromise. Here are the things that I'm interested in, here are the things you're interested in, and we only do the things that overlap. But in a long term relationship, it's helpful and beneficial to move into what Schnarch called the sex of generosity, where I identify some things that, hey, I know that turns you on. I don't know that that does a lot for me, but I will be generous to gift that experience to you because I want to give you pleasure and satisfaction. And if you'll do some of the things on my list that maybe don't do that much for you, now we begin expanding our shared erotic territory. And somewhere in that process, often people discover, like, hey, that didn't do it for me, but your pleasure does it for me. And now I'm beginning to associate this thing that didn't do it for me with your pleasure, and now it's starting to turn me on. We can expand our erotic repertoires to a degree if we're open to navigating the uncomfortable, the new, and the novel out of a love and generosity for our partners.
I love that. That's very spot on. But then to that point, like, how have you seen like men's sexual relationships differ between like their partners, if they're male or female, or is there a significant difference?
There's so much variety in human sexuality. It's almost hard to encapsulate because I do work with a fair number of heterosexual and gay couples. I've worked with a few lesbians, but as a cisgender man, they don't come to me that often. So, I've seen so many different things, and I really like leaning on the diversity in men's identities to kind of point to variety in men's sexuality. So, there's good research evidence. It kind of varies between study to study and how the question gets asked. But in gay relationships, somewhere between 30 and 50% of them have some element of openness to other partners. I think that points to a capacity in male sexuality, not a deterministic thing that all men want non-monogamy. Even in that 30 to 50% estimate among gay relationships, that's not the majority. But we do seem to have a capacity for novelty in new partners, and that suggests that we're looking for novelty, interest, challenge. And I'll often talk about intensity, something that's visceral, it's bodily, it's smells and scents and sensations that are intense. And I think that those are some of the common elements of male sexuality, but there's so much diversity in among men, so much diversity in humanity, that there's no one thing you could say that's true about all men or all people.
Oh, go ahead, Tina.
You talked about sexual generosity. Can you talk for a minute about how you explore new interests with fluidity? So, say it's an area that you both have interest in, but you have not, either one of you necessarily experienced it before, or one of you hasn't experienced before. How do you make that fluid in a way that's going to be successful?
That's such a good question, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, but it always begins with navigating the awkward first, and that means that there might be something more like an experimental session in the bedroom where you're trying that new position out, you're trying out that new toy, you're trying out that new dynamic or that new script with each other, and at first it doesn't flow. It won't ring the bell. It won't feel very sexy for most people most of the time when you're trying something new out. Especially if it's sexy for one of you and not sexy for the other one. It's like, no, not those words, these words, try putting your elbow here, not that way. Oh, okay, now this way. It's the practice and the willingness to navigate that awkward discomfort that allows you, after a couple of repetitions, to begin getting the frameworks down, the muscle memory down, the verbal script down, that then allows each incident of trying this and experimenting with to get a little more fluid each time. There's so much this myth in our culture that if we love each other, then the sex will just flow, right? But sex is a skill. And that means that we have to practice it and develop it. And sometimes that means that we really need to be drilling the fundamentals. And that's not very sexy, and it's not very intense, and it may not be very pleasurable. But we practice it, we get it down. And then there can be a time, several instances in, several practice sessions in, where you kind of lock eyes with each other and there's this grin as you realize, like, oh, now we're getting it. Now we're in the flow. We're practicing to build up the capacity to be in the flow. And a lot of communication and building consent in prior sessions brings that capacity to flow later.
Yeah, and can you talk a little bit? You're mentioning intensity, and I know sometimes when people talk on the internet, they talk about toxic sex and all that. So can you kind of talk a little bit about why the human, can we love, I don't know, I guess I should say just that toxic sex, like what makes people draw to that more so than other things, I guess.
Yeah, so, there's so many layers here. Let's start with one possibility. So, if we grow up in a family with high levels of intensity, high levels of conflict, maybe there's some elements of domestic violence or just, negativity and conflict, we experience a situation where love and attachment is paired with high highs and low lows. And our familiarity with that can mean that we have, speaking about it in the most like non pathologizing way, we just have a broad range of tolerance. You get into a relationship, it may not even feel very toxic to you, like compared to your family of origin. It's way more loving, way um, more connected. But when things get heated, words get thrown, things get said, and to you, you can just brush that off because you have this high level of tolerance because it's familiar. To your partner, it might feel very hurtful, very outside of their window of tolerance. When we pair that with sexuality, the same thing takes place, right? I love you, I can't stand you, but I don't want to get rid of you. Let's have sex to make up. And when we don't know how to maintain that level of calm and stability because that's not what's been familiar to us, then we compare some of that critical intensity, the negativity, and the conflict tolerance with sexuality. We're bringing that intensity into the bedroom. Now, again, right, there's a lot of myths about that because people will equate that kind of negative emotional experience of conflict in the relationship getting brought into conflict oriented sex into assuming that people who are kinky are replaying experiences like that. Oh, you only want, this kind of behavior because your parents didn't treat you right. And actually, the research evidence says that that's not true. When we take a look at it, people who are highly educated, who have disposable income, who have time in their hands, tend to be kinkier. Kink is a kind of play, and it's creativity and brought into the bedroom. And there's no research evidence that supports that negative behaviors in people's past makes them kinky. There's no research evidence that abuse makes people kinky. There are people who have abuse histories who are kinky. There are people without abuse histories who are kinky. And so I think it's really important to get very careful when we're using phrases like toxic sexuality that can pathologize people. What is it that we're talking about? Are you talking about an emotion you don't want to have brought into your sex? That's great. Be clear about that and hold your boundaries. Are you talking about sexual behaviors you don't want to enact? That's great. Don't do that. Hold your boundaries. But if you're looking at somebody else's sex and you're trying to judge that and using toxic to describe that because you don't like that, that would gross you out, you think that's not healthy for them, keep your opinions to yourself unless they're asking.
Yeah, that's well said. And speaking just like more healthy sex and all that, there's two sides of it. At least from I guess from the male side, is that some have like they finish fast, and then some might not ejaculate as much during sex. Can you kind of talk about how that plays into psychology and in the bedroom as well?
Yeah, so many men are so worried about this on all sides, right? I didn't orgasm fast enough. Or on the other side, I couldn't orgasm when I wanted to. So, look, there are all sorts of possible causes for early ejaculation. One of the ones that I see most commonly in my practice is that when a man pairs intense emotional attachment and love with a sexual experience and he's not used to that, the intensity of pairing psychology and physical experience can overwhelm him and he can find himself usually in a short term experience of early ejaculation. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes it's more lifelong and it shows up in a lot of different situations. There are definitely some behaviors that can change that, including one that we use in sex therapy is called the start and stop technique. Start, keep going until you feel like you're getting too stimulated, and then stop. Pause for a second, wait for the pleasure arc to subside, and then start again. Most men who engage in that process can begin to regulate their experience enough to go, okay, now I know what that rising arousal start looks like, and I know that I can stop it, and therefore I feel like I begin to get a little bit more skillful in regulating when I'm going to orgasm and when I'm not. When men take too long, there are a couple of possible things that are happening. Very often it's because he's in his head. There's anxiety. He's worried about his partner. Is he giving his partner pleasure? And that brings him out of an appropriate and healthy amount of focus on his own pleasure and his own physical sensations, which prevent him from experiencing a rising arousal arc. But there are a lot of other possibilities. Maybe he's used to masturbating with too tight a grip, and so the physical sensations are just not the same in level of pressure that he's used to. He can change that by loosening up his grip and using lubricant when masturbating more. Sometimes it's because he's not feeling the emotional connection, and that's preventing him from feeling vulnerable and losing self conscious enough to find his pleasure. There are a lot of different possibilities for all of these. If you're a man who's experiencing either premature ejaculation or delayed ejaculation, I would definitely recommend talking with a professional who's experienced in working with these issues to find out what the cause is for you. I've just listed a few.
Tina, you can go ahead.
Eric, can you talk for a minute on that same subject about how, as a partner to that man, female or male, it doesn't matter, we can better support that? So for me, like, I'm completely into, if I'm going to come 10 times, I want him to at least get one good one in there. And when he doesn't, I feel disappointed, right?
Yeah,
and I feel like I haven't served him well. But I realize that quite frequently that male partner is saying, that's not the most important part of me getting off. So how do you balance that a little, in your own head? How do you balance the fact that, or accept the fact that orgasm isn't success, quote unquote?
So this comes back to emotion regulation, right? For you and what you've described, you have a couple of expectations or ideas that you being a skillful lover connects to your partner's orgasm, and if you've been skillful then. And so the very first piece is just regulating that disappointment on your own. Right? Hey, I'm noticing that this is what's coming up. This is how I experience it. This is my disappointment. These are my expectations. And not trying to get your partner to regulate or soothe that for you. Because when you try to get your partner to regulate and soothe that for you, now your partner's having their own experience, maybe emotional around their relationship to their pleasure, but also how they feel now. Oh, I have to perform my pleasure, my orgasm for you so that you're satisfied. So my orgasm isn't really for me. And then that can get into these feedback loops between partners where you're getting in each other's heads. And separating that out and learning how to regulate the base of that emotional experience on your own and with the other people, confidants, healthcare providers that you can regulate that experience with on your own is a good start. Because if you can regulate that, then you begin to create the opportunity for curiosity. Hey, I noticed that you didn't have an orgasm during this session. What does that mean? What does that mean about me? What does that mean about us and the play and pleasure that we had with each other? And then you have to believe your partner. Hey, that's not that important to me. That's not what me getting off looks like. Sometimes I do that. Sometimes it takes me a while to get comfortable with a new partner before I can orgasm. And the more that you can believe them and just trust the process and let go of those kinds of expectations or those cultural notions that if your partner doesn't orgasm, then you didn't please them or then they didn't have a good time. And then you get to have this experience with this partner. And hey, maybe you also get to acknowledge sometimes the maps don't fit together. If it's really important to you and the partner or partners that you have don't work that way, maybe you need different partners, and that's okay too.
Eric, bringing it back to the book a little bit, how long has this book been in development, and why did you think this was like the ideal time to kind of bring this project to the world?
Yeah, I started having some ideas of writing something in the late 2017 as the Me Too process was ramping up. And early 2018 was when I first started putting words down in a Word document. I thought I was writing a blog entry. And one blog entry became 2, 4. By the time I had 8 parts, I went, oh no, this is a book. I'm going to have to do this full developmental arc to talk about, like, look, most people, most men are not predators, the kind of headline stuff we saw in the Me Too movement in the news. But there is in our culture a consent problem. And I think it really comes from a lack of men's emotional development and tools for self-regulation and a lack of accurate scientific information about physical sexual behavior and also the psychology of sex. And so that's what I fill in the book. But it was 5 years in process before I had a completed manuscript and I was headed towards publication. And about half of that time was some kind of active writing and editing process. And honestly, the other half of that time was me walking away from the book, not writing, not touching it, not opening it, trying to figure out how can I talk about this stuff on a public stage, recognizing my own faults and flaws, my own humanity in this process, and not pretending like I'm coming from the unsullied ivory tower. I'm the therapeutic expert who's done everything and I'm going to tell you how to do it right. I'm a man who's been through this arc myself, down in the trenches, making mistakes, hurting my partners, and figuring out how to do this better myself. Everything that I put in the book does have some evidence base, some practice skill behind it, that it comes from my professional background, but I've also had to learn these lessons in my own life, and I think that puts a different tone on it. And it was hard to figure out just how to do that.
Yeah, and so from that, talking about the book a little bit, were there things that didn't make the book that you still talk about a lot, or things that you may put into a different or a future book?
Yeah, I mean, my first full manuscript of the book was 105,000 words. This is the size of a fantasy novel, not a self-help book, and certainly usually not a first author's publication. So I had to pare that down by 25,000 words. So there certainly is a lot out there that I had to leave out. And absolutely, I mean, I have a number of different book ideas. I'm still waiting for the lightning to fully crystallize around like which of these potential projects am I writing first, but there's a lot more to say about what moving men and couples and our culture in general towards healthy relationships and healthy sexuality would look like.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely got a lot more questions, and that this conversation. I'm sure you get that a lot, just talking to a lot of people. I'm sure there's a lot of questions that still to pop up, but I do want to kind of shift towards just a question about more like this push in culture right now. That's like the alpha male versus the weak male, and kind of how that plays into psychology. Because I think there's a school of thought of that people follow this red pill or the Andrew Tates of the world, and this is how you're supposed to move in the world. But then there's also a level of, if you're going to have a healthy relationship and be a couple, there's a give and take there. So I want to kind of hear how you think about some of those culture ideas.
Yeah. So one of the things that it's really important to understand about the news and, the Andrew Tates and the Jordan Petersons and a lot of the other kind of manosphere influencers that lead men into deeper radicalization, whether it's racism or misogyny or, political um, movements that are increasingly fascist. It's really important to remember that we do as humans have a negativity bias. We are more motivated to read and look at news that makes us scared, that makes us afraid of something. So Andrew Tate is practically in the news every day for some idiotic, stupid thing he said. And the really unfortunate thing about that is that means that when young men are looking for a model for manhood, and they look at the popular culture, the people that they see talking about manhood most are these scary, radicalized men that a lot of the culture actually loves to hate. And they end up in this dilemma. Well, I don't see a lot of other models for manhood, but the only models that are out there are hated. So I guess to be a man means to be hated. And then they move down that radicalization pipeline. And that's why conversations like these are so valuable, because it's so important for me to point to, if you've got a young man in your life, talk with him and talk with him about the men you respect and admire. Talk with him about the qualities in men that you respect and love. Talk with him about what kind of man he might become, right? Whether that is a traditional, elbow grease, blue collar, working on cars and, mowing the lawn kind of man, or whether he's going to be a more sensitive, artsy, words, creative. There are so many models of skillful, desirable, lovable manhood. Point him towards the models of manhood that he is already inclined to, and let him know that there are other options out there. And then when it comes to what does that mean about it being a good lover in the bedroom, there are as many different models for being a good lover in the bedroom as there are men. You can be a submissive man and be a desired man. You can be a playful lover and be a desired man. You need to identify, what are your gifts that you have as a lover? What do you bring? What do you have to offer that's truly, truly authentic? Instead of trying to think, well, I'm going to become the man that is desired because women want this, or, partners want that. You got to figure out, what is your gift? And when you know your gift, when you can own it, when you can offer it clearly, there may be fewer people out there who are looking for that, but they're going to find you more easily when you are more clear and confident in offering it. I'm tender, I'm intense, I'm playful. Whatever it is, it's the right fit for somebody out there.
Yeah, that's great. Chris, did you have anything else as we start to wrap up?
No,
I just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Eric before we go. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your message. And to